Okay, well, good afternoon. My name is Steve Gotch, and I'm serving as the chair of today's Yukon River panel meetings and public session. So we'll resume in our public session where we left off prior to lunch. Was we finished up on the Restoration and Enhancement Fund presentations and received public testimony. For this afternoon's agenda, we will be receiving presentations on the postseason reviews for both Alaska and Canada as far as Chinook salmon fisheries and management measures and escapements are concerned. And we'll also be receiving public testimony at 4:30. So again, as a reminder for anyone that would like to provide public testimony this afternoon, please sign up at the back of the room by no later than 4:15, and we'll be sure to provide that testimony opportunity. As far as sequencing our schedule and agenda for this afternoon, we'll start with a review of the 2019 Yukon River Panel management recommendations to the management entities and parties, and then we'll move to the 2019 Yukon River Chinook Salmon Season Summary for the United States, for Alaska, which will be presented by Fred West and Holly Carroll from Alaska Department of Fish and Game. After that presentation, we'll take a recess. There will be a caucus for the Canadian section and Canadian First Nation government representatives. That'll be in the multi-purpose room down the hall, and the U.S. section will be having a caucus as well. Is that correct, Mr. Co-Chair? And the room will be to be defined, to be confirmed. So we'll break for caucus following the U.S. presentation for Yukon River Chinook salmon in 2019. So where we'll start off our discussion, we'll go way back to April of 2019. At the conclusion of the Yukon River Panel's 2019 pre-season meeting, the panel issued its press release with respect to outcomes from its meeting. And obviously there was information on 2018 returns and then pre-season forecasts for 2019. And having considered all of the information at its pre-season meeting, the Yukon River Panel issued some management recommendations to the parties under its authorities granted to it within the Yukon River Salmon Agreement. And there were three specific recommendations, fishery management recommendations, that were provided to the parties. The first pertained to, and I'll read it out, recognizing uncertainty in assessment and management, the Canadian origin Chinook salmon run should be managed to achieve the conservation objectives within the Yukon River Salmon Agreement, ensuring escapement falls within the established interim management escapement goal range and provides for harvest shares in both countries. So that was the first recommendation put forward by the Yukon River Panel for 2019. The second management recommendation put forward, and I'll read it as follows: to provide for Canadian origin Chinook salmon conservation, consider the use of 6-inch or smaller mesh gill nets upstream of the Tanana-Yukon River main stem confluence within the regulatory structures of each country. And just to be clear, the reference to the point upstream of the Tanana-Yukon River main stem confluence refers to areas both in Alaska as well as in Canada, so any point upstream within the watershed. And then thirdly, the third recommendation put forward by the Yukon River Panel is as follows: fishery opportunities should be provided conservatively until in-season assessment information confirms trends in abundance. So again, these three recommendations were put forward by the Yukon River Panel as part of our 2019 press release under our authority to make management recommendations to the parties to the international treaty. So now that we've refreshed our memories from our preseason meeting, we'll move into our post-season salmon summary, and I'd invite Ms. Holly Carroll from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game to provide her presentation. And I see Louise is coming, so welcome.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay from there? Okay. So many of you know me. I'm Holly Carroll with the Alaska Department Fish and Game, and what I wanted to let you know is we're going to give a presentation a little different than we normally do. And I'm glad because we have so many fishermen present and a lot of Alaskans who don't normally get to attend these meetings. But one of the things we did by request of the panel is we expanded a little bit more on explaining how we assess the run. And so Fred West, our research biologist, is going to go into a lot of detail about how we get the information in season, how we use it to predict run sizes. And then I'll give the section on how we take all that information and how we roll it into management and what that looks like and all the things that we need to consider. So it's a little longer than normal. Bear with us. We'll try to keep you awake. But what I wanted to start out first by saying is that we manage as a team cooperatively with the federal government of the United States, and there's a federal in-season manager, Fred Bew. He's going to be retiring. That was his last season this last summer. And I know you can't tell from these pictures, and nor can you tell from looking at him, that he has been working in fisheries for over 40 years. I know he doesn't look old enough, right? But he has. And I don't know if many of you know this, but being a fisheries manager is a pretty thankless job. Usually someone or many people are mad at you if you're doing your job right. And Fred is the most humble person I have ever met. He has exceptional skill and knowledge, but he hates praise and hates being in the spotlight, and so I'm going to keep this as brief as possible because I know this is a personal hell for him. But come to think of it, maybe that's why he's been managing for 40 years. He just doesn't need kudos. But I'm going to give him a little bit here because it is a huge loss to Alaskan salmon resource management that he's going to move on and retire. He has seen vast amounts of change in the Arctic and the Yukon, where he spent the majority of his career with these fisheries. And as a biologist, he's had to adapt. As a manager, he's had to adapt. And we've been lucky enough to learn from his wisdom and his knowledge. And at the heart of every decision he has ever made has been, first, the conservation of the resource, but also what the fishermen need. He's known and liked and respected by fishermen in Alaska, and possibly through his many years of service in Canada as well. And I've just been incredibly lucky and grateful to be mentored by him. He's my greatest mentor in my career, and I hope that I've learned even a fraction of the things that he has in his 40 years. An early piece of advice that he gave to me was that I needed to watch my language. We're still working on that, but I will say that when it comes to fisheries and looking at the data and using your gut and local knowledge to test what your data is telling you, he has been an incredible asset, and he's always asking the tough questions. And long after he's gone, our team is going to be saying, what would Fred do? So with that, I just want to thank you for your service. Sorry for the embarrassment, but you do deserve it. And I will pass it over to other Fred, and you will hear what he does.
Let's see. All right. So it's hard to follow up after that, but so going into the 2019 season, we had a Chinook outlook of 69,000 to 99,000 Canadian origin, and that brought the drainage-wide outlook to 168,000 to 241, and that was based on the Canadian origin Chinook Pass pilot genetics of 41%. And for the summer chum outlook, we had a run size of 1.7 to 2.2 million. That was a similar, would provide for a similar run size of the previous year. It's sufficient to meet escapement goals. and subsistence needs, and it provides for a potential surplus commercial harvest of up to 1.2 million. And the surplus would be based on the new drainage-wide escapement goal of, and the midpoint of that is 850,000 plus approximately 100,000 for subsistence use, would leave roughly 1.2 million available for commercial harvest. And similar to previous years, the department would need to balance the summer chum harvest with an overlapping below average Chinook salmon run. So kind of going over our main assessment projects we use in season. We've got the lower Yukon test fishery, and it's the lowest assessment project on the river. And the project currently uses 2 sites near the mouth of the Yukon, close to Amonic, with set and drift set net sites in the south mouth and a set net site in the middle mouth. And it's an early in-season tool to determine when fish enter the river and provide relative magnitude based on catch per rate effort data. We use the information to identify the pulses as they enter the river, but we don't actually wait to confirm the strength of those pulses until they actually reach the pilot station sonar. And the next primary assessment project we have is the pilot station sonar, and it's the primary assessment tool on the Yukon River with well-established sonar methods. It's located approximately 123 river miles, or about 200 kilometers above the mouth. It provides run size information early in the season and low enough in the drainage to inform U.S. management decisions. And it provides information about the drainage-wide run size, including all stocks. It provides information about the Canadian origin run size using genetics. And it provides age, sex, and size data of all stocks. And it provides the ability to produce 2 very useful in-season projections. One for the total number of Chinook salmon, all stocks, that will pass the sonar by the end of the season, and the total number of Canadian origin Chinook that will pass the sonar by the end of the season. And these projections are updated throughout the season as new information is available. The Canadian projection provides the best available information in season about the Canadian origin run size and how it's comparing to the outlook. All right, and then the third main assessment project we have in the U.S. is the Eagle Sonar. And the sonar is a well-established and primary assessment project to estimate the passage into Canada. It's located approximately 1,200 river miles, or approximately 2,000 kilometers above the mouth. It provides the best estimate of in-season border passage. The information is available late in the season and near the border, so passage estimates are not timely enough to influence most of U.S. management decisions. The Eagle Sonar passage is usually the sonar passage would usually be lower than the in-season Canadian run size estimate from the pilot station sonar, because it doesn't account for all the harvest that occurs between the 2 sonar projects. And it provides age, sex, and size data of all Chinook salmon, or of Chinook salmon entering Canada. And the ASL measured at Eagle is expected to differ from that what was measured at Pilot Station due to the different stocks being represented in the sample. And we're also able to provide the ability to produce in-season projections of border passage. And the projections are not available until most of the fishery management has occurred in the lower and middle river. So kind of now going over the actual results of the 2019 season. We've got the lower river test fishery. The chart is the CPU indexes, daily CPU indexes throughout the season. And we started early in anticipation of an early run, but the actual first fish was not caught until June 2nd. For this year, the CPU values were higher than the historical average. And I guess you can see the kind of like the pulses by the kind of more four main pulses that we saw in the river. And when we lay the Pilot Station daily estimates over that, it lined up really well with the passage estimates and identified the major pulses before reaching the sonar, so it fit pretty well. And it's also the estimate between the 3-day travel time worked pretty well, or it predicted the 3-day travel time, and so. So now the results from the Pilot Station sonar. The sonar is not a total run because it doesn't account for the harvest or escapement below the sonar. But we ended up with an estimate of 220,000 with a 90% confidence interval of 20,000. And as you can see from the bars for each of the annual years, we have some level of uncertainty each year. But for 2019, the entire 2019 confidence interval is above the historical average of 175,000, which is a strong evidence of a larger than average run size. Another point is that the 2019 run was 3 days later than average, with a midpoint of June 26th. And one component of the Pilot Station project is the genetics we got out of it. And so we have the daily passage estimates, and then the horizontal blue bars are how we broke the strata. And for the first strata, we ended up with a proportion of Canadian of 56%, which estimated the Canadian origin stock to be 45,000. For strata 2, we had 42%, and that the Canadian stock was 30,000. And for those first two strata, we had a higher than normal sample sizes, so they're pretty representative of what the fish were passing, and as well the proportions for strata 1 and strata 2 are really similar to what we've seen in the past, so they weren't much different than historical estimates. The only difference I think is that the first strata, normally the proportion of Canadian has always been high, but then the numbers of fish, normally the numbers of fish is higher in the second stratum, but for this year the numbers of fish were higher in the first strata. And for the third strata, we had 36% Canadian origin. That was 22,000 roughly Canadian origin. And the chart only shows the passage through the 24th, but it was the data includes all the passage through the 24th or the August 11th when the all Chinook were counted through the 11th. There was no Chinook counted after the 11th. And so that brings the end of season weighted Canadian proportion to 45,000 or roughly 99,000 with a 90% confidence interval of plus or minus 16,500. And so the Chinook and age and sex composition for the pilot station was the age 3s and 4s and 5s were below average this year, while the age 6 and 7s are are predominantly female, which was above average. Which was the proportion females were close to 50%. It was 6% above the 5-year average of 42% or. And this project uses 2.75 inch to 8.5 inch mesh, so likely all age classes represented and represents the entire drainage ride run. And another note is we had a high sample size, bigger than normal, which for 734 samples were aged in 2019 with a mean length of 739. So the mean length overall was higher than the 5-year average of 232 or 732. So now the results for this Eagle Sonar. Like the pilot station, Eagle Sonar provides an estimate, but the statistical confidence in the Eagle estimate is excellent and the best information about the number of fish passing into Canada. And the 90% confidence intervals are generally less than 1,000 for each of those years. You can't really barely see the confidence bounds for each of those years, but it's pretty small. We're pretty confident in the counts. And for 2019, it was below the average of 57,700 with a count of 45,560. And it's important to note that the Eagle Sonar is not actual border passage. Some number of fish are harvested by the community of Eagle upriver from the Sonar, but downriver from the border. And similar to pilot, the 2019 run was 3 days later than average with a midpoint of July 26th. And so, kind of the things we were talking about earlier about what different escapements are, or how we determine different escapement terminology. So we've got the Canadian origin total run. The passage estimate that Eagle Sonar provides a basis for calculating Canadian origin total run that's used by ADF&G and the JTC, or the Joint Technical Committee. And so the total Canadian origin run takes the U.S. harvest of Canadian origin fish plus the Eagle Sonar to get the total run. For border passage, it's the Eagle Sonar minus the little bit of harvest between the Sonar and the border to get the border passage estimate. And then for the spawning escapement, we take the border passage and we minus whatever the Canadian harvest is. We get the spawning escapement. And as was noted, or has been noted, the 2019 harvest is not available at this time, so we are unable to calculate the total Canadian origin run, border passage, or spawning escapement at this time until later in the season. And for the Chinook age and sex composition of the eagle, Sonar test fishery. This year, all age classes are similar to the recent 5-year average. And we expect them to be different than the pilot, as these are just the Canadian origin stocks escaping into Canada. And the proportion females are higher than above average with 47%, and for the lengths, they're really similar to the recent 5-year average, and yeah. And so now going, I guess, on the other kind of the other assessment projects we have in the U.S. side, we got are denoted by the blue dots, and those are like different weirs and towers or sonars, and we do also have aerial surveys, but those locations are not on this map, denoted on the map. And so here's a kind of a rundown, a report card of all the Chinook escapements minus the main ones I've already discussed. And we met most of the goals in the Alaska drainage for Chinook salmon, as you can see from the green estimates. Only one goal we did not meet was the Chena River and the Tanana drainage. However, we also saw below average escapements on the Gasasa and Henshaw, which are in the Koyukuk drainage, which saw record warm water temps. And now, I guess we got a couple more slides from the summer chum assessment, since it's critical to Chinook management. We have the passage at the Sonar for chum. The 1995 through 2018 average is 1.8 million. We saw our passage of about 1.4 million with a confidence interval of 85 plus or minus 85,000. And so it was below average passage at pilot. And one thing to note is the 2019 run was the latest run since 1995, and was 6 days late, with a midpoint on July 3rd. And similar to the Chinook at the pilot, this is not considered total run because we haven't accounted for harvest or escapement below the project. And here's kind of a report card of the summer chum escapements. Based on the pilot sonar count, the summer chum escapement was likely above the lower end of the drainage-wide escapement goal. And so it fell between the drainage-wide goal. And the drainage-wide escapement will be estimated post-season once harvest estimates have been finalized. And for the Chena and Salcha, as you can see, are really low, but the tower stopped operating well before most of the summer chum was expected to arrive. The counts were just getting going when they ended up pulling the project. And the escapements as you also note that the escapements into the Kasasa and Henshaw and the Koikuk drainage were exceptionally low and most likely due to heat stress related en route mortality. And Holly will go more into that. And also the genetic information that we get at the pilot sonar also indicated that the summer chum continued to enter the river past the traditional transition to fall management of June 19th at pilot. So it was definitely a late run. And with that, Holly.
Okay, wasn't that exciting? There's a lot of numbers that guy has to churn through, and I'm really grateful for this Fred as well. I used to do that job for one season. It was one season too long. Very educational for me, but I'm glad it's his brain dealing with all that. So now what we want to do is I want to walk you back through some of that information and tell you what we do and don't know about it at the time and how it influences the management actions that we take in the fishery itself. So a good place to start, actually, James, I threw this slide in at the last minute due to your recommendation. You know, we take a lot of management recommendations, first of all. We get them from this body. And so the Yukon River panel makes recommendations. I haven't covered them here. They were reviewed right before we started. But we received, in particular, consider the use of 6-inch or smaller mesh gill nets upstream of the confluence with the Tanana within the regulatory structure of each country. This is a management recommendation that goes along with actions we've been taking over the last many years. And we take the recommendations that we receive at the panel, but then we involve stakeholders. On the Alaska side, we have a pre-season planning meeting, typically that is funded by the R&E panel here, so it brings often over 100 fishermen together and the Fish Commission together, and we share the management recommendations and our preliminary management strategy and outlook, and then we take feedback from those people. And they give a lot of feedback. They even break out into groups, and they talk about how previous year's management actions worked or didn't work for them. And they'll come up with their own solutions, and it helps us finalize the management strategy. So a couple of the recommendations we received from that body was that we should consider a reduced fishing schedule if the run size demands it. Again, we've been doing that, but what they meant here was a schedule. In the past, we've used surgical openings where we're giving short notice, we're letting people fish for a few hours. It's really hard for fishermen to plan around, and so I think the point of note here is just reduce the known schedule so that it's something people can rely on and work around. Similarly, they asked that the management schedule would allow or consider fishing on the weekends. There were some districts where the regulatory schedule doesn't include a weekend, but we have the discretion to set time and area and when people can fish. So for some of those districts, we just shifted the times a bit to account for those that may have full-time jobs and need weekend fishing time. It was also asked that we maintain flexibility in scheduling openers based on local conditions, and I think they mean weather conditions, local fishing conditions, whether people are meeting their needs or not, and that's, again, something we almost always consider. And this one came from the Yukon River Fish Commission. They recognize that fishermen should and have been voluntarily use smaller mesh gill nets, and what they mean typically is 6-inch here, though they recognize that it's not possible for all families to use 6-inch all of the time. Sometimes some families don't have that. But they recognize that using 6-inch gear may conserve the older, larger fish, and it may allow the release of more females upriver to spawn. I want to take a moment to comment on this. A lot of people kind of misunderstand our domestic policies around 6-inch gear. 6-inch gear is the perfect mesh size on the Yukon River for targeting summer chum salmon. It is ideal for targeting that species. It is not ideal for targeting across all age classes of Chinook. And so Chinook are considered bycatch in that gear. So we can, as managers, use 6-inch as a tool when there's high presence of chums to allow the harvest of chum, but reduce the opportunity to harvest king salmon, king or Chinook. If people use 6-inch, they'll still get some Chinook salmon, but often their nets will be inundated with chum. But it's also important to recognize that not all fishermen choose to target summer chum. And if you have a mesh for chum that's about $1,000, you may or may not be able to afford to also have a mesh for Chinook salmon that's about $1,000. But many years ago, the Tanana Chiefs Conference recognized that we were moving towards management actions using 6-inch, and they provided a mesh exchange. So people had to hand in larger mesh, and they got a 6-inch mesh. But it's important to note that not all members of the public owned that. And when we restrict fishing to 6-inch, it is closed to anyone using a larger net. It is illegal for them to put their Chinook mesh in the water, and it can be confiscated by enforcement. So it's really important to acknowledge that the bulk of the upper river are choosing to use 6-inch, but the state of Alaska needs to be careful that we don't close a fishery entirely to some of the users. So that is a domestic policy that I'm helping bring some light around, that it's pretty complicated. So our finalized management strategy, after having these meetings and consulting with stakeholders, we publish it in a flyer and we send it to all of the households on the Alaskan side of the Yukon so that they can be aware of what kind of actions they can expect. So once the ice is out and before the kings arrive, typically the season starts with no restrictions in place. So that means subsistence fishing is allowed 24/7, and they may use the largest legal gear, which is 7.5-inch or smaller. This is an excellent opportunity for people to harvest those first few salmon that come in for their traditional and cultural practices, which are really important to Yupik people on the lower river and in many parts of the river. But also, it's a lot of access for harvesting sheefish. I realize you guys probably call them Minkanu here. Those fish come in just prior to the Chinook salmon, and a lot of people use those for their subsistence needs. But then once we have the arrival of the Chinook salmon, so once we detect presence of Chinook in our test fishery in the lower river, these are the same actions we might consider if the run is weak. We now go to a reduced regulatory fishing schedule. So that's typically just taking the schedule that exists in regulation, which is different for each district, and then just cutting it in half. And then we might restrict gill nets to 6-inch or smaller as an additional restriction. And we can go even further, and we can require no gill nets and just allow selective gear, which are dip nets and beach seine, so that fishermen can target summer chum, but release king salmon safely alive. We haven't had to do that the last couple of seasons, but it's always a tool in our toolbox. Once we're confident that the run is above the lower end of the forecast, this year's forecast, we were planning to consider full regulatory subsistence fishing schedule, relaxing to 7.5-inch gill nets, so that's Chinook gear allowed in most districts. But because of recommendations made here and with the fishermen themselves, we would consider a 6-inch restriction for most of the Chinook season in District 5. Part of this is because we know from survey data that many fishermen do choose to use 6-inch, and so that it's not a huge hardship in that area. So it's worth considering, though it's worth noting that that is a different restriction for one area than it is for the rest of the river. But if the run comes in at the upper end of the forecast, our strategy is to reduce all restrictions and then to allow commercial fishermen to have the option to retain or sell their incidentally caught Chinook salmon. Now, these are Chinook salmon that are caught in the 6-inch commercial fishery. They would be caught and killed in this fishery anytime that it is executed, but typically they're taken home for home pack use or personal use, we call it. But once we start seeing run size of upwards of 200,000, we consider the sale of these incidentally caught Chinook, and we may do that as long as we've considered whether escapement goals are likely to be met and whether reasonable opportunity was provided for subsistence, because that's a priority use in the state of Alaska. So that's the management strategy we go into the season with. But this is a little snapshot of real-time data as it came in, and I picked the point around the midpoint of the season, June 24th. And this is a graph of, these are called cumulative passage curves. So this is the passage total at Pilot Station Sonar, and then how it levels out at the end. That's the end of the season count. So for example, you see 2017 on here, we had a run size upwards of almost 260,000 at Pilot Station Sonar. And as a management tool, we don't know what the run strength or the timing is in season. We can only show you that in Fred's presentation because we have hindsight. We have to see the whole season to tell you what the timing was like. But what we can try to do to predict it is we plot it with, in this case, we put all the recent five-year runs on here for Chinook salmon. And you can see that the 2019 run was tracking higher in abundance, so further up number of fish, than 2018 and 2015. So that's looking good. 2018 was an okay year. We were able to do some harvest and able to meet our objectives from an escapement and harvest share standpoint. So we knew that the run was looking okay. From a timing standpoint, it was tracking almost identically with the 2018 run. So we knew it wasn't terribly late or anything like that, any major concerns there. So that's kind of what we look at to figure out timing and abundance. And then Fred is able to create a projection from this data using timing, and we had an in-season projected total count of 200,000. That's an above average run. Then we take the estimate of the Canadian origin passage. 94,000 is a number we got in season. So just to clarify, this projection you're seeing there, I just picked the projection we had on the 24th. Every single day he's producing 7 or 8 projections based on various factors. We consider them all. So this is an ever-changing number in season. But what we can say with pretty good confidence is that we had a projected Canadian run size past pilot of 94,000, which meant the upper end of the forecast and above average run size. So one of the things we always got to do with our sonar is the counts are the best they can be, but there's a lot of error, measured error around those sonar estimates. So we gut check that against fishermen reports, and they help to tell us if the test fishery data we're seeing at that project is making sense. They help to tell us if the magnitude of the run is making sense. And then also it verifies swim speeds and where the pulses are in the river. We need to know all of that for where to put our management actions. Where are the groups of fish? And then we know when to close, when to restrict, and we tie all that together. But what's the most important for management is now that you have an estimate of a run size, what is the harvestable surplus available to Alaskans? And so what we do is we take the in-season estimate of 94,000 Canadian origin, and we know we need to meet that escapement goal of 42,500 to 55,000. So you just basically subtract that from our in-season Canadian run size. That should give us the range of total allowable catch that the two countries have, 39,000 to 52,000 fish. Then we have an agreed to harvest share. I've shown the midpoints here. Canada has a midpoint of 23%. So they have 9,000 to 12,000 fish that we need to endeavor to get extra above and beyond meeting this. So we're not trying to get 42,500 to the border. We're trying to get a range of this plus this to the border. We expect Eagle Sonar Passage to be this number plus this. That's what we are planning for in the management team. Then we calculate what is the U.S. harvest share. Our midpoint is 77%. And so we were looking at this year a range of 30,000 to 40,000 available for Alaskans to harvest. Now, for perspective as a manager, you want to look at, okay, how do we control the harvest level to fall within that range? And so you look at recent years. And in 2017, we want to look at that year because that was a high run. That was a run over 200,000. That's what we were seeing this year. And in that year, our harvest postseason was 21,000 Canadian origin fish. So now I know if we have a run size similar to 2017 and we take similar management actions, we should easily be able to harvest 21,000 fish and not exceed our harvest share. But what if the run size is more like 2018? The run was certainly tracking 2018 as far as timing. So I wanted to show you what our U.S. harvest in 2018 was. That's last year. Our Canadian origin Chinook harvest on the U.S. side was 19,300. So again, if we take pretty similar management actions to 2018, we should be able to not exceed our harvest share range, and we should even maybe get to harvest a few more fish than we did in 2018. So that gives us a lot of direction as managers as to what kind of actions we need to put in play in the fishery. So one of the things we do to guess how many fish people will harvest pre-season, since we don't have the information until everyone's done harvesting, and then we go door to door and ask them what their harvest was, we have to guess what their harvest will be. And we're actually pretty good at understanding the relative harvest of each community. Some communities prefer summer chum and they take less Chinook. Some people have high numbers of households and so they have a larger harvest of Chinook, and they have very consistent harvest patterns over time. We've been studying these for 30 years. So for any given community or district, we can pretty much guess what they're capable of harvesting given certain run sizes and given certain management restrictions. But we do rely on anecdotal reports from fishermen and from the Yukon River Drainage Fishery Association surveyors. All of you that call into those weekly teleconferences, I can't encourage you enough to do that. It's super helpful. But those reports of how fishing is going, those directly help managers gauge whether our actions are having an effect or not, either positive or negative. So it's super essential to helping us see if the harvests are in line with what we think they should be. For instance, when we need to restrict because run sizes are small and people are really angry, we're doing our job right. They may be frustrated, but we know they're not getting many fish, and that's kind of the point, and it's our opportunity to explain, yeah, we're trying to limit your harvest. Sorry, that's what these actions are doing. So this year it was interesting because people were saying they were doing really well harvesting. But many factors affect the harvest in addition to the management actions we take. Fish abundance is a huge one. So if the run is doing really well, people catch really well. And if the run is poor, those fish are sparse and hard to get. But in this year, in 2019, the absence of the chum, and the chum salmon are usually 10-to-1 for the Chinook in most districts. So the absence of the chum run meant that people were having pretty good catches of Chinook salmon, and we were hearing that. But also weather and environmental factors can also have an effect. We could have fishing wide open, but if it's pouring rain or high debris, fishermen will not fish and the harvest will be very low. And so restrictions may be overly excessive. So we have to react to environmental factors as well. And then you're also going to deal with personal needs. Maybe people have decided they don't want to take salmon, or they're going to change the needs, or maybe they have larger families, or maybe they don't have the money to go fishing. So all of those are going to factor in. But one of the things I want to show you here is this super messy looking chart of water temperatures. This is over 35 years of water temperatures down in the lower Yukon River at our test fish project near Emonic. For those of you that haven't been there, this is a massive body of water where these temperatures come from. This isn't a little stream. It's over a mile wide and over 90 feet deep in some places. So this is a huge body of water that takes a long time to cool down and a long time to heat up. But what this chart shows, the blue area is the warmest, the maximum temperatures over the 35 years, and the bottom is the lowest temperatures. The purple line in the middle is the average. And as you would expect for the Yukon, in early May, it starts out quite cold. It warms up to around 66 degrees on average, and then it cools down in fall. But what I want you to draw attention to right now is that the red line is 2019, and by this same midpoint date I've been showing you in the season, we were seeing that our data was showing us that for this time of the season, we had already had over 10 days of record warm waters in the lower river. These temperatures are nearly 18 degrees for those Alaskans, 68 degrees. That's like great swimming weather for us, but for fish, it's known to show heat stress. It can even cause mortality in salmon. The problem with our understanding of heat stress is a lot of the research has been done in labs, and even though that we know that this can kill salmon, a migrating salmon can pass through this warm water, go find a cold refuge, and possibly survive just fine. But we didn't know the extent of heat stress that could be occurring in the salmon, but it gave us major concern. This area of warm water, exceeding 70 degrees for well over 10 days. This occurred long after the Chinook run had completed in the lower river, but it likely affected the Chum runs. So we have our June assessment snapshot of Chinook, and I painted you a relatively rosy picture, but this is the similar thing. I've plotted the cumulative passage at pilot station Sonar, but I didn't pick the recent 5 years for Chum because when I did that, this year's counts didn't even register on the chart. The magnitude of the run was so low that it wouldn't show up. So we took the latest years on record and the weakest years, and we plotted them here. And what you can see is that by about the 24th of June, when we're trying to manage the Chinook run, and the Chum run is supposed to be overlapping 10-to-1, it was not showing up. And you can also see from 2019 here that see how it's the furthest along. This is what tells us it's the latest run we've seen because it's behind all these curves. Now, the other scary thing about this chart is that this dotted line is the lower end of our drainage-wide escapement goal for summer chum salmon, which is 500,000. On this date, we knew that we had no indication that we would meet the bottom end of the summer chum escapement goal. So needless to say, we were a little bit freaked out. So our in-season management considerations this season were kind of more complicated than normal. We had record warm water temps, so we actually maintained conservative actions so that harvest would be limited despite the above average run strength. I hope it's not an overshare, but in season I discussed with my Canadian co-managers what we were seeing at the border and why was it so low, and also that it's weird that we had so many restrictions in place when we're counting over 200,000 fish at the Sonar, and I had to be honest and say we're a little scared about the heat stress or the potential for heat stress. And so we kept conservative actions in place on the subsistence fishery for Chinook. But we also had this seemingly poor summer chum run, and so we actually allowed the fishermen to use 7.5-inch gear to target Chinook because we wanted them to avoid summer chum. So they can still catch summer chum with that gear, but the ideal gear is 6-inch. They can always choose to use 6-inch, but with low abundance of summer chum, they were less likely to be as successful or to go out after those fish. So we were sort of in conservation mode for summer chum to the point where, and this has not happened in over a decade, we put closures in place. We closed tributaries and the coastal district in order to conserve summer chum. We gave a week's notice on those closures, and then thankfully the run dynamics changed very quickly. We had large groups of summer chum come in, and our projections shot back up, and we were able to pull those closures. But we were in conservation mode for summer chum, and it was a very different situation than what we've been dealing with lately. So the in-season subsistence management actions that we ended up taking in most districts was the opportunity with 7.5-inch during the trickle, which is just the early salmon coming in before the first pulse. So in every district, it would have been open before that pulse arrived to them, but then once the first pulse was up in each district, we would have reduced their fishing schedule. Then we had 6-inch restrictions for at least 1 to 2 periods in every single district. And we also had canceled periods. I can't stress enough for you what a canceled period is. The regulatory schedule allows in most districts 2 openings per week. That's only 2 times that a fisherman may go out and try to meet their needs. In each district, we pulled one of those openings. That means they get to fish 1 time in a week. Because of where District 5D is, way up in the river, and because they need a longer time to fish because they have so many tributaries and the fish are so dispersed, they typically have a longer fishing window, so it tends to be 3.5 days when we cut it in half. When they had a closed period, it meant 10 days of closure, no fishing at all for 10 days. So these were real restrictions. And I'll be honest, there was a lot of time when the management team asked ourselves, are we being too conservative for a run size that's over 200,000? Are we going to get a lot of flack for this? Turns out no. But it definitely is a surprise to us what ended up occurring. So at the end of every season, as we transition to the fall season, we always relax subsistence schedule back to full-time and to 7.5 inch. This is usually done by an administrative date, so down in the lower river, typically it occurs July 16th when the fall manager takes over. And then it shifts as the fish passage with travel time upriver. We always consult with the fall manager. If we had a conservation concern, we could always delay this. But this season, we relaxed to the full schedule on the normal dates. I think it's important to note that when people report meeting their needs or being done fishing, continued restrictions may not be necessary or may not have further significant effect. So that last point, when I talk about we relax the schedule, it usually comes at the very end of the Chinook season. Most people are trying to wrap up their Chinook fishing while the drying weather is good. They're not going to extend all the way to the end. So a lot of people might think, gosh, well, when the run is doing so terribly, why would you relax? If everyone is done fishing, that relaxation is going to have very little effect on the harvest. And we were hearing on the teleconferences that people were done fishing very early on. So a quick review of summer chum commercial management. We didn't have a fish wheel fishery because of a lack of a market and buyer in District 4. So that was much simpler since we had such a late run anyway. We didn't bother going with selective gear types because there weren't chum to fish on overlapping with the Chinook run. We had to wait until we were past the midpoint of the chum run before we were confident there was a harvestable surplus of chum. So we went straight to the 6-inch gill nets for summer chum. And it's always allowed for fishermen to retain those kings for personal use. As predicted, with a run size over 200,000, the department did allow the sale of the incidentally caught Chinook salmon, but that was after 95% of the run had passed District 2, 99% of the Chinook run had passed District 1. So it was the final 1% of the run that those fishermen were fishing on, retaining and selling. And so the harvest of summer chum was about half what it typically is. This was a huge financial blow to the communities of our lower and middle river. This is one of the only economic benefits and drivers of the community. We have a processing plant that hires from local hires only, local villages, typically anywhere, I think it's up to 600 people a summer, and it was closed for weeks. People called every day asking if they had a job. It was a pretty depressing state of affairs. But thankfully, we did get some of these surplus summer chum harvested. And then of the salmon that were the Chinook salmon that were incidentally harvested, we took about 4,284. That's above the recent 5-year average. But that average includes years when there was almost zero because of our conservative actions extended the summer chum commercial fishing so late that there was almost no retention of Chinook. So this average being higher is just because there was a higher abundance of Chinook in the river. So of those that were retained, 3,105 were sold. The majority of these were male fish, dominated by age 4 and age 5. And because this is the final 1% of the Chinook run, genetics tell us that these are typically lower river-bound stocks. These are not typically Canadian-bound Chinook, and they tend to average about 10 pounds in size. But it was a good boon to the lower river fishermen to offset those lost costs in the summer chum fishery. So, quick review of our preliminary management report card. I didn't put a big fat F on top of this because my boss was like, please don't say you failed. But, I mean, it wasn't great, right? We had a mixed bag of success with escapement goals for chum and Chinook in the Alaskan drainage. Our number one priority is to meet goals. And so it's always a concern when you're not meeting all of your goals. We had lower than expected border passage, and this was despite many restrictive measures and an above-average drainage-wide Chinook run strength. So from a management performance standpoint, that's something you need to look at. Why are we surprised at what we're seeing at the border? We shouldn't be. It's likely that the full Canadian harvest share was not provided above the minimum escapement. As I explained to you, that was never the plan. It sure looked like there was plenty of fish for everyone to get to fish. So it's important that we speculate on management performance. That's always an integral part of our team. We're going to look at how our assessment, how our management did. And one of the things is there's no harvest estimates yet, but the department has speculated that we likely harvested 25,000 Canadian origin Chinook. That would be higher than the last 2 years. That makes sense for the run size. But if the in-season estimate was that there were 95,000 Canadian origin salmon passing pilot, and then 45,000 made it to the border, what happened to 50,000 Canadian origin Chinook? This is a valid question to be asking. I'm going to jump the gun on some of the things I've looked at so far. So if you have a discrepancy like that between your in-season abundance estimate and the border passage, in any given year, so this is true every single year, if there's a discrepancy, it could be caused by any or all of these following things I'm going to discuss. And the first is that the Alaskan harvest is much higher than anticipated. Maybe we harvested way more than we think. I really, really doubt that we doubled what I think. We're pretty good at estimating that harvest, but I don't have those values for you, so it's kind of a pointless road to go down to speculate until the spring meeting. It could be that there was more unmeasured en route mortality than usual. What do I mean by that? This summer, we had the warm heat stress related water temperatures, but we didn't get sort of confirmation of the effects of this until mid-July, when fishermen on the Koyukuk River and the Andreevsky River, those are lower and middle tributaries in the Alaska drainage, they reported hundreds and hundreds of dead chum salmon. These carcasses were fresh-looking carcasses, no net marks, and there was a major die-off. We got to go check this out, and it's impossible to estimate how many fish died, but we counted close to 1,000 carcasses on the Koyukuk. We did not have in-season reports of Chinook, but you would expect that because experts who are used to lab studies tell me that the Chinook bodies are bigger, and in the main stem river, if they were to die from heat stress, they would sink, and they're less likely to be seen dead, floating. After the season, we did have reports from fishermen in the upper river that reported seeing smaller king salmon dead in eddies that are normally too big, probably to show dead fish, but they were low. And then when that fisherman reported that, another fisherman was like, oh yeah, I saw some dead kings way down in Y2 in the Anak River. So we do have some confirmed verbal reports of Chinook, but it will be impossible to know what was the extent of this die-off. What we know for chums is that tens of thousands of chum salmon did not arrive at the Henshaw and Gassasa Weir. So it had a huge effect on the chum, and we don't know the effect on the kings. So we can't really talk much about harvest. I've covered en route mortality. That's going to be hard to measure and account for. But what's something we can look at and we look at every year? What if we overestimated the Chinook Passage at Pilot Station? That's something we got to think about every season. It's something we look at in season all of the time. So I want to dive into that a little bit. What would be red flags that it would indicate that our pilot station sonar overestimated Chinook? You would see larger catch of Chinook than other species. So what I'm saying is a non-representative catch of all the species present. And as a reminder to those of you who aren't familiar with the lower river, there are more than 10 species counted at that sonar. There's humpback whitefish, broads, there's a huge population of cisco. In any given year, we will count 1 million other species, and we will count nearly 1 million summer chum and only 200,000 Chinook. They're a drop in the bucket. And this year, we didn't see evidence in the test fishery that was unusual. There was plenty of whitefish abundance. We were catching lots of things. So there's no indication that we overestimated somehow in the test fishery the kings. And the test fishery is used to apportion the counts. The sonar is just counting fish targets, and the test fishery tells you the relative proportion of the species in the river. The other thing that would have been a red flag is if the genetic proportion of Canadian origin fish were super different or unusual. And as Fred covered, those proportions by strata were nearly identical to what we'd expect for an odd year. And when I say odd, I mean numerically odd, but it was also an odd year. But from a genetic standpoint, it was exactly what we expected. Each stratum had pretty average results and gave us no red flags, and we had really nice sample sizes that gave us more precise data. What's more red flags? Well, you can get at some sonars, if you don't have a weir to push the fish out in front of your transducers, you can get fish that swim really close to shore. And then what happens is your test fishery is drifting in front of your sonar. The fish are being counted on the sonar, but they're not caught in the test nets. Sometimes that happens with pink salmon because they'll swim right on shore. This is not a thing that Chinook do. Chinook swim deeper, and we weren't seeing any evidence of this during the season, of high volume of fish on shore that might not have been detected. So another thing people will ask about is, how do you know you're not counting downstream objects, such as debris or milling fish? Well, this year there wasn't much debris. Also, the sonar identifies directionality. And the proportion of downstream versus upstream targets wasn't unusual. So we weren't seeing a massive downriver migration that we were accidentally counted as upstream. Also, when fish are milling, that means that they swim upstream, and then they float downstream in front of the sonar, and then they swim up again. So you can imagine that would be a double count. Maybe we double counted kings. But this is not a common migrating strategy of salmon. And the other thing is that the bulk of our fish at Pilot Station Sonar are counted by a video sonar known as an Eris, that's the brand name, and it doesn't include downstream targets. So we weren't double counting fish because they're floating around in front of the sonar. It's a problem we're always looking for, and we didn't see it this year. So the final thing would be, if local knowledge does not match what your test fishery shows, then you have a problem. Is the efficiency of your test fishery somehow different than what fishermen were seeing? And this year, the reports from fishermen were that Chinook catches were very good, and it matched what we are seeing in the test fishery. But there was also a noticeable absence of overlap of those high chum rates, which meant higher efficiency for the fishermen and the test fishery. So I've covered 3 things it could have been, 3 things we would look at. But what about if it was an underestimate at Eagle Sonar? Well, this sonar doesn't have the same complex apportionment we have at Eagle. You have complete discrete passage of salmon. And by that I mean you just have one species moving through at a time. So our test fishery doesn't need to figure out what all fish are we counting here. They're just kings. And then at the very end of the season, when you're down to maybe 50 to 100 fish a day, you might get some overlap with fall chum. But then again, you're only going to be seeing the first 20, 30 fall chum a day. So we're talking very low abundance. And that's the crossover point. This happens every year. This year it was around August 15th. And it varies depending on the run timing, but the measured error around the estimate at this sonar, as Fred covered, is less than 1,000 fish. So we don't think we underestimated at the border, and the escapements in Canada, which I don't want to spoiler alert, they weren't amazing. So that's indicative that our Sonar passage estimate is spot on. So while we've discussed a lot of possible reasons the border objectives weren't met, we can't really speculate on improvements, management-wise improvements for next year until we have all of the data. And here's some of the data we're going to discuss at the next meeting. We're going to have the U.S. harvest estimates. From that, we'll figure out the Canadian origin fish that were harvested on the U.S. side. We'll get the final Canadian harvest. We need those two values so that we can calculate the spawning escapement and figure out if we met that goal or not. Then we'll take the Canadian origin Chinook total run size. We have to know that to be able to calculate the true harvest share that should have been taken by each country. We don't have those values yet. We have our in-season estimates now. So we'll need those values. We'll figure out what the harvest share was to figure out how close we came or how not close. And then we'll calculate the drainage-wide Chinook run size. So that's all the fish that were available on the Alaska side. And then what we learned from this season, as well as the 2020 forecast, those are all going to affect our management strategy next year. And that's probably what we'll be discussing in more detail in the spring meeting. So that was a lot of information. I want to thank you all for your patience. Most of you look awake. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both to Fred and Holly. I think given where we're at in our day, we'll look to take a break for about 15 or 20 minutes or so. The Canadian section will caucus in the multi-purpose room, and the U.S. section maybe in this room in the corner. Sure. But yeah, so we'll look to resume the public session at approximately 10 to 3. So thank you very much.